Well, hello everyone. Thanks for being here today. We're here to talk about how can we secure critical minerals supply chains. A very easy topic, not complex at all, and we have the expert here. So great to have Dom with us here today. As Andrew mentioned, Dom is head of global affairs at Appian Capital and the former deputy prime minister of the United Kingdom. Want to start right at the top, Dom. Given the work that you and Appian do with the Securing America's Future Energy, or SAFE, you have a partnership with them, specifically looking at critical minerals. There's sort of two key events that I want to sort of get your feedback on sort of right away. The election of Donald Trump in the United States and sort of how you see that affecting the critical minerals ecosphere globally. And then also the tension that's rising with China over critical minerals. We saw, of course, yesterday, China is blocking exports of certain critical minerals to the United States after the United States took some actions on semiconductors. So can we get sort of your reflections on those two areas?
Well, look, great to be here, and thanks very much. Thank you for the introduction. Look, in terms of the new administration, I think you can expect to see some refocusing of the strategy. I also think it's worth saying, I don't think you'll see a wholesale reversal, because the strategic imperatives of de-risking from China, providing economic security, particularly around critical minerals and rare earth supply chains, I mean, they're bipartisan. I mean, it's interesting the pick of Secretary of State in Marco Rubio, who I got to know when I was Foreign Secretary, because he was one of the co-authors of the, as you know, Rubio-Warner Critical Minerals Act. And so strategically, I think there is a bipartisan support for de-risking and for building up that supply chain security. Tactically, the means to achieve those ends, I think you're going to see some greater emphasis on tariffs, tax cuts rather than subsidies, although quite how much the Inflation Reduction Act gets mauled or revised is an interesting question. 80% of the funding has tended to go to red states. I think we'll see certainly one issue which I think you can expect to see a more forward-leaning approach will be permitting. When you look right now, it takes an average of 28 years, I think, to build a mine in the US. Their second slowest, Zambia, I think, is only the slowest. And that is something actually there's a bipartisan support for, but certainly the president-elect has talked a lot about. So a refocusing rather than a wholesale reversal, I think.
Okay. And what's your perspective on steps that China's taken just even in the past 24 hours?
Well, look, that's not the first export restrictions on the 3Gs, graphite, germanium, gallium. I'm glad I remembered all three. But we're going to see more of that. And I was in Tokyo recently, and they're worried about the next rare earth critical mineral that's going to be subject to those export restrictions. So actually, that's continuity. But how do you de-risk? And I think that is the exam question. I think there are going to be two things which are going to be vital. Public-private partnership. So how can we take advantage of the comparative advantages we have as free market democracies in the West? What financial support do we need from government, whether it's loans or tax credits or offtake agreements, all of that stuff. And how can we unlock the innovation and the high ESG standards that investors like Appian, but I'm sure many in this room, want to see. I think the second thing we will need to see is greater friendshoring. There's a lot of talk about onshoring, and I think there'll be some of that as we think about our supply chains. But let's be honest, neither the US nor any other Western power can meet its critical mineral needs just by onshoring alone, so we'll need some more friendshoring. At that point, the Mineral Security Partnership becomes interesting. But can we bring in some of those so-called non-aligned countries? So if I look at the US, a lot of talk about nuclear power. Where will the uranium come from? It's not going to come from US shores. Canada, Australia, Namibia. If you look at rare earths, and the defense applications that the Pentagon want, where's that going to come from? It's not going to come from the US, it's not going to come from China either, from the looks of things. Can they bring in Brazil and Vietnam? I think that agility will be an interesting question to see how the new administration responds.
And you referenced your previous role as Foreign Secretary, and Senator Rubio, now designate for Secretary of State Rubio, coming into the role. I mean, reflections on where you think the Mineral Security Partnership could go. It does seem like there's an attempt by the outgoing Biden administration to cement as much of the MSP as possible. You know, Jose Fernandez was in Greenland, of all places, 2 weeks ago to really try to cement down this partnership there. We have not seen as much from President-elect Trump on the MSP, thoughts on kind of where he might take it?
Look, my sense, and I got to know Senator Rubio quite well, but my sense more generally, I don't think that there's going to be a big plug of multilateral bodies, right? I don't think anyone thinks that the new president is going to do that. On the other hand, there is a certain agility and lots of talk about deal making. So, I mean, the real
Let's make a deal.
Let's make
a deal.
So the MSP has tended to focus on the US's transatlantic and Pacific traditional allies. India joining was interesting because that's a classic non-aligned country and a linchpin influence in the geopolitical world, not necessarily massive in critical minerals. Can the US, whether it's through the MSP or otherwise, coax in from South America and Latin America the likes of Peru, Argentina, Brazil? We just to give you one illustration, we invest in Graphcoa. It's a business, mining business that is high-end graphite for the EV market, but it's then processed in a company called Urbix in Arizona, feeds the North American EV market. That's a good example of public-private partnership. We just had a $130 million grant from the current administration. But can it also be an example of friendshoring? Because Brazil is a big player in the space. If you turn your vantage point to the east, to what extent can we bring in the Philippines? Saudi Arabia, I mean, we've had the Vice Minister for Minerals here. I think Saudi Arabia is going to be a big player. Indonesia under new President Prabowo, keen to be less reliant, dependent on China. These are the kinds of things where, whether it's through the MSP or just that deal-making agility that the new administration is sort of, and Donald Trump is famed for, I think those are the kind of areas to watch. One thing is absolutely critically clear. We will not secure our supply chain security for critical minerals and rare earths and meet our energy needs, let alone the green transition, without slight more a step change of greater agility in that space.
You mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act. Many of the tax credits baked into the IRA, first off, we'll see whether they go or not, or President-elect Trump tries to get rid of them. But putting that aside, the mechanism is tied to whether or not countries have a free trade deal with the United States. The United Kingdom, for instance, does not have that, but it's part of the MSP and many others. Do you see that stumbling block, I'll use that term, as sort of stopping the expansion of the MSP internationally, or do you just see it as something that can be worked around?
I think there's always a workaround when it comes to the approach and the mindset the new president will take. But fundamentally, I don't think that those strictures will work. Equally, the MSP is fairly, it's quite broad now, and it needs to get broader, but it's fairly shallow. The MSP gets countries together, and there's, I think SAFE and the administration have done a good job in starting those conversations, but it's the point of departure, not the point of arrival. I'm not sure there's a huge amount of depth to it yet, but then again, we're at the start of this journey. The bottom line is it doesn't really matter whether it is through plurilateral structures or multilateral structures like the MSP or bilateral arrangements. We will need collectively, in terms of that volume and range of critical minerals and rare earths, to bring in other countries, and particularly non-aligned countries who do not want to choose between China and the US. Is that okay with us in the West, in Washington? I think it's going to need to be. And again, you come back to this distinction which between supply chain security and de-risking and onshoring. A lot of talk about onshoring. I think it's a good thing. I think we're going to see some onshoring, but actually we're going to need to see a quantum leap in friendshoring if we're going to get supply chain security. It's not the same thing as Jobs for America, but it is in terms of the EV market and the kind of things that I would suspect someone like Elon Musk is going to be talking to.
Yes, yeah, he does buy a lot of critical minerals. Talking about all this diplomacy, Dom, one thing that sort of takes the oxygen out of the room with diplomacy is the talk of tariffs, and they, by definition, are a restrictive tool and a blunt instrument.
Yeah.
But the president-elect has talked about putting them on a lot of finished goods or on anything from a particular country, whether it be Canada or Mexico. He hasn't necessarily put anything down on paper yet that's concrete. There's a lot of talk out there. When it comes to the critical minerals sphere, though, how would you rank the potential for a tariff on, say, nickel from Indonesia or cobalt from the DRC in a hypothetical to affect critical minerals markets?
Look, at the margins, I think they can, but they don't answer the question, which is where do you get your supply from? If you look at nickel, there's probably enough nickel around. The bigger problem is price manipulation, I think, right now. I think, as you said, I think tariffs in this space are a fairly blunt tool. At the end of the day, you've got to work out how, collectively or individually, we provide the volume and the range to provide a secure supply chain. And what's our comparative advantage? We know that the command economies have a certain comparative advantage, subsidies, long-term planning, and then price manipulation. But we've also got some comparative advantages. High innovation, high ESG. We invest in a business called US Strategic Metals in Missouri, and it doesn't just do the extraction and the processing, now does the recycling. You've talked a lot about this in your book, but if we want an end-to-end supply chain that is both energy efficient, but is also starting to deal with the longer-term challenge of recycling, which can help with volume, I think those are the kinds of things we need to deal with. I mean, I thought you can tell Christmas is coming up. I have to plug Ernie's book, but if you haven't got The Wall Below, you should get it. But it talks about the recycling as the next bit, a piece of the jigsaw. I think it's really important.
Recycling, for sure, a huge issue for us all to consider here. We've been talking a lot about the top of the supply chain here. I'm wondering how conversations you had with automakers, with OEMs, and other manufacturers about these issues are going, and how they're seeing the shifting sands here when it comes to these issues.
Well, the OEMs talk a great game, but there was a great survey by McKinsey recently that suggested that fewer than 15% of OEMs will pay an extra 10% for ESG grade minerals. When I put this to a conference in the United States, the first hand that went up said they're absolutely certain that the 15% were lying. I don't know. I think, though, the OEMs need to be brought into this. Again, is Elon Musk useful for this? But otherwise, you're going to have not just price volatility, but the kinds of things we've seen with nickel and other critical minerals and rare earths. And you're going to have, ultimately, a supply chain problem for them. So we do need to try and get together and find some solution, which I would hope will be somewhere short of mandating it, because that's a pretty blunt tool.
Sure.
But I think OEMs are part of the solution. I mean, again, is it IRMA, the
Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance?
Right.
Yeah.
How is that developing?
Yep.
I mean, you talked a lot about it again in your book, but I think businesses talk about it in poetry, but when it comes to delivering, there's a lot of prose around there. But then again, I appreciate the challenges for the businesses in this space. We need to come together. And again, although it's a challenge for us right now, perhaps the combination of our public-private partnerships, the best of government, the innovation and the entrepreneurial spirit of businesses is actually the solution for this. But one thing we know is we're 20 years behind China, and we want to make this a race to the top, not a race to the bottom.
You talked about some of the investments that you and Appian have been made in the critical minerals space, and at the same time we know that as China takes steps to limit exports, and in the light of automakers obviously trying to get supply, I mean, do you think, you talked about mandates being a blunt instrument, but could it get to the point where we're going to have to say, you just have to pay X% more for graphite or for other critical minerals if you want a secure supply outside of China? Do you think it gets to that reality?
I would hope not. But definitely that challenge is there. The two big problems that we have are the cost of capital. CapEx for mining projects is inherently challenging, but then you add on the competition with China, and that's a challenge. So financial support is important. But can the foreign policy wrapper be made to work for us? For example, spending aid money in development policy. For example, if you're investing in Africa to provide the infrastructure, whether it's port facilities or rail and road, is there a combination that could actually be very effective? Those are the kinds of things that we're going to need to do. And again, high ESG standards. How do we make sure that we're making an offer, for example, to some of those interesting non-aligned African countries, which does hire their local staff, which China is not notorious for doing, which does commit to those communities long term. You're starting to see with Belt and Road a slight retrenchment, and that's partly as a result of China being burnt from the debt not being paid back on time, and partly the African and other developing countries bristling against those terms and those conditions. That's an opportunity for Western countries to think more collaboratively with them.
When you think about ESG, the average consumer doesn't necessarily think about what goes into making their laptop, for instance. But there are horror stories people hear about, maybe young children in parts of Africa that take cobalt out of the ground, and people sort of naturally are averse to that. But from an investor perspective, how do you think through what the average consumer doesn't necessarily think about that often, i.e. they don't actually think necessarily about all of the component parts that go into their automobile or their laptop or their cell phone, and yet you as an investor still hold companies that you invest in to pretty high standards. So how do you sort of balance all that, if that makes sense? Yeah.
Look, some of it is trying to inform public debate. Some of it is trying to look long term. That's the thing that, Eisenhower always used to famously say, that I've got urgent problems and important problems. The important problems are never urgent. The urgent problems are never sufficiently important. And it's trying to get voters and consumers to think long term, because certainly the costs for them, whether it's those moral issues or frankly just the cost of energy in this country, in the Western world, is going to go up, let alone the defence applications, let alone the green transition. So I think it's about trying to educate about that long-term enlightened self-interest, which investors play a part in, journalists play a part in. But to be honest with you, governments are so far behind the curve on this. I don't think you can expect the electorate to be grappling with these issues if we don't, as investors, as policymakers, as the media, start talking about this as a long-term project. I don't think, so speaking from my experience in the UK government, I really woke up to this challenge in terms of critical mineral supply chains and the supply chain vulnerability during the pandemic. But once your eyes are opened, you realise you've got to try and take action. And by that point, as the gentleman in the front row is laughing, China's 20, you say 10 years, China's 20 years ahead already. But we're not a command economy. And, this is one of the challenges and the vulnerabilities, the Achilles heels of democracies. So how do we bridge that gap? I'm a cup half full guy. I think we can do it, but we need to marshal our forces and work together.
In the time we have left, I wondered if I could ask you to, look into your crystal ball, and what if we're here 12 months from now? Where do you think the critical minerals industry will be broadly, knowing that we'll have at that point 9-10 months of a President Trump administration and other sort of geopolitical maneuvers potentially?
Well, there's always going to be winners and losers in this space, but I think the fundamental dynamics are you need to take a long-term look and view. There's clearly going to be massive demand, something like $3 to $4 trillion worth of extra demand for critical minerals and rare earths by 2030, if that's your horizon. That's McKinsey's estimate. And so there's a huge opportunity there, but there's a lot of volatility along the way. We've seen it with nickel. I think you'll see it with other critical minerals. How do you navigate that? Because the one thing businesses want is, aside from the cost of capital, is the long-term stability.
The certainty.
And that is something that the market currently doesn't have. So how do we bridge that gap?
So if I just unpack a little bit what you just said there, there's been a lot of hand-wringing in the electric vehicle market about some of the sales rates in the West, for instance, even though China's sales continue to increase. You would tell people, based on what you just said, calm down. I still see huge increases later this decade into the next decade, if I follow you correctly.
So I think headline, that's true. But there's going to be some bumps along the way. And I mean, with the EV market, we're still grappling with cost versus range.
Right.
And that has a significant impact on which critical minerals you'll mine, because different things will fuel different technological advances. But long term, I still think there's a big opportunity for us here. But we need to focus on it more. It needs to go up that, become less of a long-term strategic issue as an immediate burning issue for us.
Awesome. Dom, thank you for your time. Great to have you here.
See you. Thanks very much.
Cheers.